In this video, I'm going to offer you my thoughts on the Sigma 18-50mm f2.8 DC-DN lens. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Now in this video I'm going to offer you my review of the Sigma 18-50mm f2.8 zoom lens. Now of course, as a Fujifilm user, this is going to be based on my experience with the Fujifilm version of this lens, but this exact lens is available for several other mounts as well. Now for those of you who have watched my channel for a while now, you'll know that I never really got along with zoom lenses. So even some of the best in the industry that I've owned, like the Fujinon XF 16-55mm f2.8 or the Nikkor 24-70 f2.8, have always ended up going unused because I prefer the look of the images that I get from my fast prime lenses. Now, in the lead up to owning this Sigma lens on the Fujifilm system alone, I've owned the XF 16-55mm f2.8 and even two copies of the kit 18-55 f2.8 to f4. Now, both of these I was never really happy with. The Pro Zoom basically because of its size and weight versus what it had to offer, and then the kit lens because of its variable aperture. But I still find myself in need of a zoom lens from time to time, and this little Sigma seemed as good as any, so I decided to purchase one. Now, I've been surprised in quite a few ways, but also disappointed in others, and this is the lens that I'm going to end up keeping though, so let's take a closer look. The build of this lens is very much in line with Sigma's modern quality. Now, it's every bit as premium as Fujifilm's own lenses, and even if it does feel quite a bit different in the hand from some of the XF lenses, it doesn't feel inferior in any way in terms of quality. However, its design deviates enough from Fujifilm's own lenses that users of other Fujifilm lenses may become a little bit annoyed with it. Now, three main culprits for this exist, and they all lie in how you use the lens. Firstly, having the focus ring closer to the body than the zoom ring is the exact opposite of Fujifilm's lenses, and in fact I would actually go so far as to argue that it makes no sense on a lens of this size. Now perhaps on a large zoom lens like the 100-400 or something, you might need the zoom ring further out so that you can support the lens with your hand while zooming, but this tiny little lens doesn't really need that, and it just wreaks havoc on your muscle memory. Now, the second thing is that the zoom ring rotates in the opposite direction to Fujifilm's lenses. Now, it might seem like an insignificant thing, especially if you're a hobbyist and only own one or two lenses, but for anyone who owns other Fujifilm zooms and uses them day in, day out, and you rely on muscle memory to be able to operate your lenses, this just trips you up every single time you put the lens on. And finally, there's the lack of an aperture ring. Now, I understand that Sigma makes this lens for other mounts, and the tooling would be similar enough that it makes no financial sense to just make one just for Fujifilm. But when it comes to the ergonomics of Fujifilm lenses, they work best with an aperture ring. Now, especially considering that this isn't a cheap lens, I really feel that they could have spent the extra time and money to perhaps craft a lens that would really fit seamlessly with the Fujifilm system. Now, those are my major gripes with this lens, and as you'll see going forward, if you can get past those, it really is a handy little lens. Now, finally, in terms of build quality, it is worth mentioning that there is no firmware update port to be found on this lens. Sigma has gone to the trouble, and probably the expense, of integrating Fujifilm's firmware update protocol. So you can just drop the firmware onto a memory card and update the lens just as you would with a Fujifilm lens. Sigma has also gone as far as to include vignette and distortion data in the lens, so Fujifilm cameras can correct for JPEG files on the fly, and your software can correct them really easily after the fact. So well done, Sigma. I'll also include autofocus and image stabilization in this section because there really isn't enough to talk about to warrant having their own sections in this review. So autofocus here is driven by a stepping motor, which is absolutely rapid. So no complaints at all with this lens. It just locks on quickly and accurately in every situation. Now onto stabilization. Now this is one of the key differences between this and the Fujifilm lens. And all of my camera bodies now have IBIS, so it's not really a concern for me, not really a sticking point for me. But if you are using one of the older XT bodies, or maybe a body without stabilization like an XE body, the Fujifilm lens may be a better option just because of the stabilization that the lens offers. When it comes to image quality, there's not really much that requires an in-depth analysis with the Sigma 18 to 50mm, so let's go rapid fire here. Now, it performs about as well as you would expect from a lens that covers a whole lot of useful focal lengths, but comes in at about half the price of a good quality prime that covers just one of those focal lengths. But let's take a bit of a closer look though. When it comes to sharpness, the center is good at all focal lengths wide open, with the wide end being a little bit softer than the zoomed in focal lengths. Now, from f4, all focal lengths are about equal and produce good detail in the center of the frame. At the 18mm end of the lens, the corners are quite soft at all apertures. They never really get to what I would call good. They are quite good at the middle of the zoom range, and then they begin to soften up again as you get towards the end. However, they are still a little bit sharper at the 50mm end than they are at the 18mm end. The vignette this lens produces is quite heavy wide open at the extreme ends of the zoom range, but it does clean up significantly by f4. It's also very easy to correct for thanks to Sigma's built-in profiles. As for chromatic aberration, it's quite well controlled and really only shows up in the out of focus areas as a little bit of blue and red fringing, and it's nothing obnoxious, and you really won't even notice it unless you actually zoom into the images. Now, flare and ghosting. Flare is very well controlled, and I haven't noticed any reduction in contrast when having the sun nearby the edges of the frame. However, ghosting when the sun is in the frame can be quite significant, and you need to be very careful to avoid it. Sunstars are slightly visible even when the lens is used wide open, and they do begin to show their final shape by f4, and then they continue to grow as you stop the lens down. But when shooting towards the sun, ghosting can be quite an issue at times, so you do have to be very, very careful. However, at night you'll see small and well-defined stars that don't really take over the image. Finally, bokeh. Honestly, it's not bad at all. Now, on the long end of the lens, because of that close focus distance that you have, quite shallow depth of field is possible and nice bokeh results from it. At night, you are going to see a little CA fringing the bokeh balls, but otherwise it's decent, and I feel like it doesn't really detract from the images at all. It does take on the shape of the aperture blades after about f5.6 though, so using it wide open results in the nicest bokeh. As you can see, this little lens from Sigma is a decent performer. Now, it doesn't perform like the amazing primes that Fujifilm produces, and it's not in the same league as the XF 16 to 55mm f2.8, but it's also not priced like any of those lenses, and it isn't nearly as large or heavy. Since I've already talked about the major differences in usage between this and Fujifilm's XF offering, I want to spend this section discussing all of the things that you can do with a kit zoom lens. Now, although lenses like this often have some optical shortcomings, especially when compared to very expensive primes, they are useful lenses, and everything that I say here, aside from talking about the constant f2.8 aperture, could apply to most of the kit zooms out there. The versatility in focal lengths is the one thing that makes a lens like this Sigma such a great addition to the kit. Now, if I consider the way that I work, the vast majority of my images are made at focal lengths of 18mm, 23mm, 33mm, and 56mm, which are the primes that I have with me at every single session I photograph for a client. These are the focal lengths that I find most useful for the way that I like to shoot, and all but one of them is covered by the Sigma lens, and even the 50mm end of this gets you close enough to 56mm that it could really pass for that lens in a pinch. On the wide end, this lens allows you to take in quite a bit of the world and gives some nice perspective distortion when you want it. Now, I found this really useful when I'm out riding on my bicycle. So typically when I ride, I'll take the X100V and sometimes the two conversion lenses if I feel like it. But if I'm going on a longer ride, sort of out in the mountains or something like that, I'll often take the Sigma because I can get just a little bit wider and a little bit longer with a single lens than the X100V kit allows me to. So these images are basically just a record of the things that I see, with the occasional image that I'm happy to share with the world coming out of it as well. So I was absolutely glad to have it with me on this morning riding out of Seoul with the low-lying clouds everywhere. Now, being able to get a good amount of perspective distortion to show the size of that bridge leading across the river essentially made this image, in my opinion. Now, I was also able to get a variety of images really quickly at different focal lengths and then just continue with my ride, which was absolutely great. Now, being able to get that variety of focal lengths that I like to use in quick succession is also great for scouting new locations. Now, since this lens essentially covers all of the focal lengths that I'll use on a typical portrait shoot, I can use a single lens and a single body to scout a location just to get a feel for what might be possible without carrying a bag full of primes. Now, of course, the depth of field that I often often work with requires fast apertures like f1.2 and f1.4 on the Fujifilm cameras, so I generally have to basically extrapolate in my mind what the scene might look like. And that's easy enough, and I'm not delivering any of these images to a client anyway, so quickly walking around and checking how a scene might look at different focal lengths is a really great use for this lens. It's also a great lens for when I'm traveling, so being so small and light, there's really no reason to leave it at home. It just slips in your bag and you barely notice it. And I actually had it with me on my last trip down to Hoi An in Vietnam, and I enjoyed a couple of extremely lightweight mornings, basically just walking around the old town with it. And it was a great respite from carrying around the other lens that I had with me, which was the behemoth that is the Viltrox 27mm f1.2. And for as lovely as that lens is, there is nothing compact or lightweight about it. Walking around, choosing a focal length very quickly and making dozens and dozens of images on my short walk was a really freeing experience. It's not just for personal work though. I have found it quite useful when running a photo wall at some corporate events. Now, the quality that comes out of this lens is perfectly fine for the instant prints that I have to provide in situations like that, and there would really be no benefit of using some of the finer primes that are in my bag, as I'll be stopping down to f5.6 and f8 anyway for a situation like this. And so the Sigma lens essentially gives me the freedom to change my focal length depending on how many people show up at a particular shot for the photo wall, and I don't notice a difference in the prints. You may notice a bit of a theme here. I'm not really talking about any specific point of image quality, any bokeh, or any other characteristics of the lens. Instead, the focus here is really on the versatility that this lens is able to offer. Being able to go wide for some perspective distortion, jump into a longer shot and get some shallow depth of field, or even just use the classic street focal lengths of 23mm and 33mm at a moment's notice is what makes this lens so enticing. So where does this little lens stand? Image quality is decent, autofocus is great, and it slots right into my workflow with the other Fujifilm lenses, since Sigma seems to have actually paid for and not reverse engineered Fujifilm's lens protocol, and that really does make a big difference to the overall package, especially when it comes to post-production and being able to correct things really quickly. But there's no real single defining characteristic about the image quality that would make me recommend this over the Fujifilm 18 to 55mm. The real things that make a difference here are the ergonomics, the lack of OIS, the price, and the constant aperture throughout the zoom range. And for me, that final point is important enough that I chose this over rebuying the XF lens. Now, honestly, the XF 18 to 55mm f2.8 to f4 is a much better value proposition, especially if you get it as part of a kit or get it secondhand. And possibly when this new Fujifilm lens becomes available, it will likely be an even better buy again over the coming months. Now, I think for most people, the Fujifilm lens is probably a better buy. However, if you, like me, want a constant aperture value all the way through the zoom range, this is certainly a good option and you won't be disappointed with the image quality. So hopefully this review has been somewhat useful to you, but if I did miss anything that you're curious about, please do let me know in the comments below. Now, as always, thanks for watching and enjoy the slideshow.